The fluorescent lights in the intake corridor of St. Aurelius Medical Center buzzed with a low, persistent malice that Nadia Reyes had long since stopped hearing. It was the kind of sound that burrowed into your skull after the first week and simply became part of the architecture of the place, like the antiseptic bite of the air, like the perpetual squeak of rubber-soled shoes on the pale beige linoleum, like the distant mechanical rhythm of ventilators cycling in the ICU 3 floors up. Nadia had been working at St. Aurelius for 11 months. She arrived every morning at 6:45, poured exactly 1 cup of coffee, black, no sugar, and sat in the corner chair nearest the window where the grey Chicago dawn pressed itself against the glass. She drank in silence. The staff who arrived early enough to share the room had stopped trying to make conversation around the 4th month. She wasn't unfriendly, she simply wasn't available. Her official title was Senior Medical Interpreter, Language Services Division. Fluent in English, Arabic, Farsi, and Pashto, conversational in Dari and Urdu, with clinical vocabulary in 3 additional dialects the hospital's HR system had no category for. On paper, extraordinarily valuable at a Level 1 trauma center serving Chicago's sprawling Northwest Corridor. In practice, the person Dr. Collins called when he needed someone to translate his contempt into a language a frightened family could understand. She was 38, 5'6", with the dense, economical build of someone who had spent years carrying real weight, rucksacks, body armor, over terrain that did not accommodate weakness. Dark hair pulled back in a tight knot, eyes a deep brown, almost black, holding the stillness of someone for whom stillness had once been survival. On the morning of the Tuesday that changed everything, Nadia was stationed outside Trauma Bay 4, waiting. A family from Kandahar, father, 2 adult sons, had arrived with a grandmother who had suffered a severe ischemic stroke. Language services had been paged 12 minutes ago. Nadia had arrived in 9. She stood with her back to the wall, clipboard in hand, watching the morning shift through the glass, monitoring the monitors. Old habits. You're blocking the corridor. The voice came from her left, sharp and carrying. Dr. Marcus Collins. He was 44 years old, chief of trauma surgery, and moved through the hospital with the particular velocity of a man who had never once in his professional life been required to wait for anything. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of angular, photogenic face that ended up on hospital brochures. He wore custom charcoal scrubs he'd once noted distinguished him from the nursing staff, like a flag. Nadia stepped 2 inches to the left without looking at him. "I said you're blocking the corridor," Collins repeated, stopping now, turning to look at her fully. He had the specific manner of a man who expected to be looked at when he spoke. "Who are you waiting for?" "The Rahimi family," Nadia said. "Trauma Bay 4. The patient in Bay 4 is the grandmother." "The family needs." "I know what's in Bay 4, Collins said. He glanced at her badge. His eyes moved from her name, to her department title, to her face, and back to her badge in the space of 2 seconds, performing a rapid, unconscious calculation that sorted her into a category beneath his administrative concern. "Language services," he said, as though reading a mildly disappointing test result. "You're the interpreter." "Yes. You don't need to stand in the corridor. There's a waiting area on the 2nd floor for non-clinical staff." He was already moving again, already past her. "When I need you, someone will call you." Nadia didn't move. "The family is in the corridor, Dr. Collins. They arrived with the patient, and they're not going to sit calmly on the 2nd floor while their grandmother." "I don't dictate hospital logistics based on what makes families comfortable." He said it without turning around. "That's not trauma surgery. Get them to the waiting area, or I'll have security relocate them." The corridor was not empty. 2 nurses at the station had heard every word. The intake nurse Carla had gone very still. Nadia said nothing. She walked to the Rahimi family, 3 men in a tight, frightened cluster near the bay entrance, the eldest son turning a paper cup in his hands, and spoke quietly in Dari, what the monitors meant, what the team was doing. The eldest son's shoulders dropped. The younger brother exhaled. Collins, inside the bay, glanced through the glass at the small group and then at Nadia. His jaw tightened. He said nothing. This was the established pattern between them. It had been established in the third week, when Collins first encountered her in the ICU, asked the charge nurse who she was, received the answer, and looked at Nadia with the blankness of a man sorting her into a category from which no subsequent evidence could remove her. The category was, not a concern. Over the following 11 months, he had never learned her name. He referred to her, when he referred to her at all, as the interpreter, or language services, or, on 3 occasions that Nadia had noted with the data collection instinct of someone trained to notice patterns. That woman from your department, the one who's always in the corridor. He questioned her translations, not because he spoke any relevant language, but in the reflexive way of a man who questioned everything from sources he considered peripheral. He'd ask the attending to repeat the question directly to the patient and watch for a discrepancy. There never was one. He never acknowledged this. In the second month, he had filed a complaint about interpreter overreach. Nadia had provided real-time resuscitation updates to a mother whose 7-year-old daughter was dying on the table. The CMO reviewed the nursing record, saw that 3 nurses credited Nadia's communication with keeping the mother upright, and filed the complaint accordingly. Collins did not stop making them. In the 7th month, he had, in front of a full trauma team, referred to Nadia's presence during a complex multi-trauma case as a security variable I'm not comfortable with, and asked the charge nurse to have her wait outside. The charge nurse, Helen, 30-year veteran, had looked at Collins for a long moment before saying, with the careful neutrality of someone filing the moment away for later, "Of course, doctor." Nadia had stepped outside. She had stood in the corridor. She had breathed slowly and evenly, her face arranged into the expression Helen would later describe to the CMO as the most disciplined composure I've ever seen in a person who was being treated like a threat. Act 2. What accumulates? 3 weeks before the Tuesday that changed everything, the incident with the Khalil family happened. The Khalil family came through the ER at 11:43 on a Thursday night. The father, Yusuf, 61 years old, had collapsed at a community dinner. Borderline ARDS, bilateral infiltrates, oxygen saturation falling fast. Collins was on call. The family, 2 daughters and a son-in-law, was in the hallway, speaking simultaneously in Arabic to intake staff working from a translation app and getting approximately 40% of the meaning. The daughters were trying to communicate one critical thing. Their father had a documented severe allergy to a class of antibiotics, information sitting in a chart at a different hospital, and they needed someone to understand this before someone administered the wrong thing. Nadia had been called by the charge desk. She arrived in 4 minutes. She walked to the family, listened for 45 seconds, and then walked to the bay entrance. "Dr. Collins," she said through the glass, "the patient has a documented allergy to fluoroquinolones. The family is trying to communicate this. His prior chart is at Northwestern." Collins turned from the patient. He looked at Nadia with the particular expression he reserved for interruptions from sources he considered non-clinical. "I didn't ask for your assessment of his medical history," he said. "I asked for a translator when I need one. They're telling you about a drug allergy. I have access to his intake information. His intake information doesn't include the allergy. It came from a different hospital, the family." Step back from the bay. Collins's voice had dropped to the register he used when he wanted to signal that a conversation was over. "If I need you, I will call you. You are not a clinician, you don't assess, you translate." Nadia stepped back. She looked at the triage nurse standing at the station. The triage nurse looked at the chart. She looked at Collins. She was 26 years old and had been at St. Aurelius for 8 months, and Collins was the chief of trauma surgery. She said nothing. Nadia turned to the eldest daughter. In Arabic, calm and low, she said, "Tell me the name of the antibiotic, the exact name if you know it." The daughter told her. Nadia took out her personal phone, a deliberate, visible gesture, the kind that could be reported, and sent a text message to Helen, the charge nurse, who was on the floor above, with the patient's name, the drug class, the specific medication, and the words, "Allergy not in intake chart. Family is certain. Please verify before any antibiotic administration." Helen received the text at 11:51. At 11:53, the attending physician assisting Collins, a third-year resident named Dr. Okafor, who had more clinical instincts than his inexperience should have allowed, reached for the antibiotic tray. Helen walked through the bay door at 11:54 and said, quietly and without drama, "Hold on the antibiotic, Dr. Okafor. We're verifying an allergy." They verified the allergy. It was real, thoroughly documented, and would have produced anaphylaxis in a patient whose respiratory system was already failing. Yusuf Khalil survived. He was in the ICU for 4 days and went home on a Tuesday. Collins never mentioned the text message. He filed, the following Monday, a formal complaint with hospital administration citing Nadia for unauthorized clinical interference and circumvention of attending physician authority. He used the phrase, "I am raising this as a patient safety concern," which was, Nadia would think later, not entirely inaccurate, just pointed in entirely the wrong direction. The HR director, Robert Steele, called Nadia in. He was not unkind. "Dr. Collins has significant standing here," he said, which was his way of explaining why he was going to do what he was about to do. He issued her a formal warning. She signed it, folded her copy precisely, put it in her bag, and went back to work. The following 3 weeks were the worst since she had started. Collins had communicated his position on Nadia to the hospital's social ecosystem without saying anything quotable. The result was a subtle shift, a cooling in certain corridors, attendings suddenly requesting alternative interpreters for straightforward cases. Not all of them. Helen remained Helen, but enough. Collins himself, in the single direct interaction they had in the 3 weeks following the formal warning, passed her in the corridor outside radiology, looked at her with an expression that contained something Nadia recognized as the specific satisfaction of a man who believed he had settled something, and said, "Language services," in exactly the tone he always used, and walked on. Nadia watched him go. She thought about a great many things in the 2 seconds it took him to round the corner and disappear. None of them were things she allowed herself to feel, because she was very practiced at not allowing herself to feel things that she could not act on. She went to the break room. She poured a cup of coffee, black, no sugar. She sat in the corner chair. She looked at the gray Chicago sky outside the window. She was so tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. She thought about putting in her resignation. 17 times. Each time the same answer pulled her back. The patients who came through those doors speaking Dari or Pashto or Arabic, who needed someone who understood not just the language, but the weight of being afraid in a foreign place, and also sick. She stayed. On the Tuesday, that changed everything. She was standing in the corridor outside Trauma Bay 3 at 2:17 in the afternoon, waiting for a translated consent form to be signed by a patient's family, when her phone buzzed. She looked at it. It was a number she had not seen in 3 years. A number she had never deleted. She stared at it for 4 seconds, then she answered. "Racist," said a voice on the other end. Male, low, the cadence of someone who had spent years giving orders, where clarity was the difference between mission success and catastrophe. "Carver," Nadia said. Her voice had changed. Same volume, different register. "We have a situation," Carver said. "Secure?" Nadia looked at the corridor. A nurse was charting at the station 20 feet away, not paying attention. "Go ahead." "We've got one of ours," Carver said. "Burned. Active op. He took a hit during an exfil. He's in the field transport now. Closest level 1 with the right surgical capacity is your location." A pause. "We're coming in, Nadia. 40 minutes. Nadia closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them, they were different. Not colder, clearer. The way a lens sharpens when someone adjusts the focus. "What's the package?" she said. "Penetrating thoracic, right hemothorax, probable intercostal laceration, field chest seal holding but degrading. He's conscious, Arabic-speaking cover, can't break it without blowing the whole op. The surgical team at your facility needs to work around that. He'll need someone who can communicate in theater without breaking his cover identity," Nadia said. It was not a question. "That's why I'm calling you and not the hospital switchboard. ETA 40 minutes. 38 now." "I'll be ready," Nadia said. She hung up. She put her phone in her pocket. She stood in the corridor for 1 moment, her eyes on the middle distance, sorting through the variables with a speed that looked, from the outside, like stillness. Then she walked to the charge desk. Act 3, The Arrival. Helen looked at her when she asked her to page Collins. Dr. Collins specifically asked that. I know what he asked, Nadia said. Page him anyway. Tell him language services has a critical incoming requiring immediate consultation. Tell him it's a trauma case. Helen looked at her for one more moment, something in Nadia's face, not expression exactly, but the absolute quality of the stillness there, made Helen reach for the phone without further question. Collins arrived at the charge desk 4 minutes later, still in his surgical cap from a procedure he'd apparently just scrubbed out of, irritation preceding him like a pressure wave. He saw Nadia and the irritation sharpened into something more pointed. What is this? He said, not a question. Incoming trauma, Nadia said. Approximately 32 minutes. Penetrating thoracic injury. Right hemothorax. Field chest seal in place. The patient is an undercover operative. She said the last words with the same register she used for all the preceding clinical information. Factual, unembellished. He is maintaining an Arabic-speaking cover identity for active operational security reasons. He cannot communicate in English in front of any personnel not cleared for his status. You will need me in the room for the entire procedure. Collins stared at her. Several things moved across his face in rapid succession. Disbelief, condescension. The specific species of contempt reserved for people he believed were dramatizing their own importance. Undercover operative, he repeated. You're telling me. I'm telling you what I know and when you need to know it, Nadia said. The rest will be apparent when they arrive. You called me out of a procedure for this. Collins's voice had dropped to the register she recognized. Language Services called the Chief of Trauma Surgery out of post-op for an incoming penetrating thoracic trauma, Nadia said. Yes. Collins looked at Helen. Helen was studying her computer screen with great dedication. He looked at Okafor, who was standing near the station and had heard all of this, whose face had the particular quality of a man choosing very carefully to have no discernible reaction. Get me the incoming report from EMS, Collins said to the room, and somebody find out where this actually came from. He looked at Nadia. You. He pointed toward the corridor. You wait. You don't enter the bay until I authorize it, and after this comes in and turns out to be a miscommunication, or whatever this actually is, I'm going to have a very direct conversation with your department head about appropriate use of emergency protocols. Nadia said nothing. She moved to the corridor. She stood with her back against the wall, her arms at her sides, and she waited. 29 minutes later, the sound changed. It started as a vibration in the floor. Not the sharp percussive thud of the rooftop helicopter pad, not the high whine of the civilian medevac. Something lower, heavier, a rhythmic concussive displacement of air that Nadia felt in her sternum before she heard it through her ears. The strip lights in the corridor flickered once. The crash bay radio erupted, multiple frequencies bleeding over each other, the controlled urgency of professional voices coordinating a complex movement. A security guard at the ER entrance had gone to the window. He turned around with the expression of a man who had expected an ordinary Tuesday and was reassessing this assumption rapidly. There's vehicles in the ambulance lane, he said to the room. A lot of vehicles. The first thing through the ER doors was not a gurney. It was 4 individuals in civilian clothing, dark jackets, dark trousers, the particular quality of stillness and readiness that civilian clothing could not fully conceal, who entered the space with the systematic efficiency of people who had assessed it before they walked through the door. They did not have weapons visible. They positioned themselves at the room's key points with a precision that, to anyone who knew what they were looking at, was unmistakable. Behind them came 2 more individuals in the same configuration, and behind them came the gurney. The man on the gurney was in his mid-30s, dark-complexioned, wearing what appeared to be the layered clothing of someone from a Middle Eastern context. A field chest seal, the kind not available in civilian trauma kits, was taped over his right chest. His eyes were open. He was conscious. When Nadia's eyes met his across the room, she gave a single small nod and he was still. Walking alongside the gurney, speaking rapidly and quietly into an encrypted radio in his left hand, was a man Nadia knew, Carver. He was in his 50s, grey at the temples, with the face of someone who had spent decades outdoors in difficult places. He wore a dark jacket. On his belt, visible when his jacket shifted with his movement, was a credentials case. Behind him came a woman in her 40s in a dark blazer, moving with the focused deliberateness of someone accustomed to walking into rooms and immediately commanding them. And behind her, entering last and filling the doorway with a presence that had nothing to do with physical size alone, came a man in a dark suit with the American flag pin on his lapel and the particular bearing of someone whose authority was not institutional but structural, built into the air around him. The ER, which had been operating at its usual mid-afternoon pitch of controlled chaos, went very quiet. Collins appeared from the direction of the trauma bay, where he had apparently been waiting and watching the radio. He came toward the gurney with the expression of a man who was still operating on the assumption that he was the highest-ranking person in the room. "I'm Dr. Marcus Collins, Chief of Trauma Surgery," he said, falling into step beside the gurney. "I'll need a full handoff report." "Who are you with? Where's EMS? This patient should have come through standard." "Dr. Collins," Carver said without breaking stride, "I need you to move to my left and let this woman do her job." He was looking at Nadia as he said it. Nadia was already moving. She had positioned herself at the head of the gurney, leaning down toward the patient's ear, speaking quickly and quietly in Arabic, her voice low and steady. The patient responded. His hand, which had been gripping the side of the gurney, relaxed incrementally. Collins stopped walking. He looked at Nadia, at the positioning of her body, the quality of her focus, the way the men in dark jackets had rearranged themselves slightly to include her in the protected perimeter without anyone giving an audible order, and something in his face shifted. Not understanding. Not yet. But the first hairline crack in the certainty. "She's an interpreter," Collins said to Carver. The word came out differently than it usually did, slightly less steady. "She's my former chief medical officer for special activities," Carver said. He handed a sealed medical brief to Okafor, who had appeared at Collins's shoulder. "That's his clinical summary, everything you need for the thoracic repair. The field seal has been holding for 94 minutes. He's stable, but won't stay that way. I need him in a surgical bay in the next 6 minutes." The woman in the dark blazer had materialized at Collins's other shoulder. She showed him a credential case, not the kind hospitals issued. Collins looked at it, his jaw moved. "You need to understand something, doctor," the woman said. Her voice was conversational, without heat. "The patient on that gurney is a source of active intelligence, with equities that extend to 3 ongoing international operations. His cover identity is his only protection right now. Everyone who interacts with him needs to speak to him as though that identity is real, because the people who want him dead are very good at finding inconsistencies in the aftermath. Ms. Reyes is the only person in this building qualified to manage that interface. She goes in that bay. She stays in that bay. And when this is over, she briefs the team. Not you, her." Collins looked from the credentials to the woman to Carver to the man in the dark suit who had still not spoken and was standing near the ER entrance with the stillness of someone who was accustomed to being the last resort. "I am the attending surgeon," Collins said. His voice had lost the easy authority. It was finding the edges of something it hadn't encountered before. "In my surgical bay, In your surgical bay, you save his life," Carver said. "That's the only thing we need from you. Everything else, who he is, who we are, why we're here, you handle through her." He looked at Nadia. "You good?" "Get him to Bay 1, Nadia said, and they moved. Act 4. What was always there? The surgery took 4 hours and 11 minutes. Collins was, whatever his failures of character, an exceptional surgeon. Inside the bay, stripped of the social architecture that had made him insufferable and left with only the work, he was formidable. Steady hands, fast, accurate decisions. Nadia stood at the patient's head throughout. She communicated his responses, his orientation, his pain levels, the fluctuations of his alertness as anesthesia moved through its phases. She conveyed information to the surgical team and received it and relayed it back in the compressed, precise language of someone who had done this in places that made a surgical bay look like a controlled environment. When the patient's cover identity required maintenance, twice, once when a hospital staff member entered the bay unexpectedly, and once during a moment of semi-conscious agitation, Nadia was already there, already speaking, already managing the interface between what was real and what needed to appear real, without a gap wide enough for anything dangerous to fall through. Okafor, working as first assist, watched her during the moments when the surgical field permitted it. The angle of her posture, the way the men in dark jackets outside the glass deferred to her in the micro-gestures of people accustomed to operating under clear chains of authority. He filed it away. The patient's right hemothorax was successfully drained. The intercostal laceration was repaired. Collins closed the chest with the care he brought to all his closures, technically impeccable, aesthetically almost serene. When the patient was transferred to the recovery bay with a status of stable and improving, Collins stripped his gloves in silence and stood at the scrub sink for longer than was necessary, looking at his hands under the running water. Nadia came out of the bay to find Carver and the woman in the dark blazer and the man in the dark suit waiting in the corridor outside. The hospital's administrative staff, Robert Steele, the HR director, and above him, the CMO Dr. Patricia Huang, had been summoned and were standing at a careful distance, the way people stand when they're present at something they don't entirely understand but recognize as significant. The man in the dark suit spoke for the first time. His voice was low and measured, the kind of voice that had given important orders in important rooms for a long time. "Miss Reyes," he said. "Director," Nadia said. Carver was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who had been waiting for something for a while and was now watching it happen. Robert Steele, who had been listening from the administrative cluster nearby and had heard the single word, "Director," looked at the man in the dark suit with the expression of a person running a rapid background search in their own memory. "Are you?" he began. "The director of the Defense Intelligence Agency," Helen said, from her position at the charge desk. She had done this quietly, in the tone of someone completing a sentence that needed to be completed. She had been at St. Aurelius for 30 years. She had seen a great many things. She looked at Nadia with the expression of a woman who had suspected something for 11 months and was now seeing the shape of it clearly. Dr. Huang stepped forward. She was a small woman with the disciplined manner of someone who had built a medical center through competence and political skill in equal measure. "Can someone explain to me what exactly—" "I'll explain," Carver said. He was brief and precise, which was the only way he ever was. He explained that the patient currently in St. Aurelius's recovery bay was a field operative of significant value to the United States intelligence community, who had been operating under deep cover in a context requiring native-level Arabic fluency and cultural literacy to interface with safely. That the operative had been extracted from an active operational environment following a combat injury. That Nadia Reyes, known to the intelligence community by her former designation and rank, at which point he said her former rank aloud, and several people in the corridor went very still, had been the only qualified individual in the Chicago area with the clearance, the clinical skills, and the operational background to manage the handoff and the surgical communications simultaneously. He explained concisely her background. Not all of it. Operational details remained what they were, but enough. The Joint Special Operations medical training, the 11 years in field environments across 3 theaters. The role she had held before she resigned her commission and disappeared into the civilian sector in the way that people sometimes disappeared when they needed to stop doing what they had been doing before they became something they couldn't come back from. He did not editorialize. He did not need to. Dr. Huang listened to all of this. She looked at Nadia. She looked at the formal warning sitting in Nadia's HR file, the existence of which Robert Steele had mentioned to her 2 weeks ago, which she had flagged for a second look and not yet gotten to. Collins had appeared at the edge of the corridor. He had heard Carver's briefing from approximately 10 feet away. He was still in his surgical scrubs. He had the look of a man standing in a room where the walls had just rearranged themselves into a configuration he didn't recognize. The director stepped forward. He was not a man who performed gestures without intention. Every movement was purposeful, measured, the product of a discipline that went all the way down. He stopped in front of Nadia. He looked at her with the specific quality of attention of someone who had read every file on a person and was now seeing the person the file described. On behalf of the agency and the department, he said, I want to express our gratitude for what you did today, both today and, a fractional pause, for what you did before today. He reached into his jacket and produced a small case. He opened it. Inside was a citation, classified, the seal visible, the text visible only to those positioned to see it clearly, and beside it, a coin, heavy, dark, the specific weight and density of something that was not decorative. This is the director's coin, he said. It's given at the discretion of the agency director for extraordinary service. It's yours. Nadia looked at the coin for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, though her face was still. She took the coin. She held it in her palm for a moment, feeling the weight. Thank you, sir, she said. Behind the director, the operational team, Carver, the woman in the blazer, 3 of the individuals in dark jackets who had been present throughout, came to attention. Not a performed theatrical gesture, a quiet, synchronized movement, the natural expression of people operating within a culture where certain things were done a certain way, and this was the way this was done. They stood at attention for Nadia Reyes, the interpreter, in the corridor of St. Aurelius Medical Center at 6:49 in the evening, as the Chicago sky outside the windows went from gray to the particular deep blue of winter dusk. Dr. Huang turned to Robert Steele. She said 3 words, quietly. Robert Steele nodded, his face the face of a man for whom a great deal had just become significantly clearer. Collins was still standing at the edge of the corridor. Several of the nursing staff who had gathered, drawn by the gravitational pull of something unusual happening, were looking at him. Not with hostility, precisely, with the particular attention of people watching someone realize something. He was looking at Nadia, 15 feet, 11 months, a formal warning in an HR file. 3 times he had called her a security variable, and the memory of each instance was apparently arriving with some force. She looked back, not unkind, simply present, herself, fully, without the practiced diminishment she had maintained for 11 months. She didn't look like the interpreter anymore. Okafor, standing to Collins's left, said nothing. He was a young man with good instincts, and his instinct now was that some moments required no commentary. Collins opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the coin in Nadia's hand, at the director standing in the corridor of his hospital, at the operational team standing at attention. I owe you an apology, he said finally. His voice was stripped down to something uncharacteristic, quiet, the performance entirely gone, just the sound of a man arriving somewhere he hadn't expected to arrive. More than one. Nadia looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. She said it without malice and without warmth, the way you acknowledge a fact. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. He turned and walked back toward the surgical wing. Carver materialized at Nadia's shoulder with a cup of coffee, from where, unclear, but he had always had a talent for producing necessary things. You look terrible, he said. I look fine, Nadia said. 11 months invisible in a Chicago hospital. I was running something in Kandahar for 3 years, she said. This was quiet. He handed her the coffee. She took it. Black, no sugar. We have a position, Carver said. He said it without preamble, which was how he said everything. Clinical advisory, half field, half stateside. You'd be attached to the medical support cell. It's not what you were doing before. Lighter operational tempo. But it uses all of you. Nadia looked at the coffee. She looked at the coin in her other hand. She looked at the corridor of St. Aurelius Medical Center, the pale beige linoleum, the fluorescent lights, the charge desk where Helen was watching her with the expression of someone who was already grieving a departure and also entirely glad about it. The families who come through this ER, Nadia said. The ones who don't speak English. Who's going to? There are other interpreters, Carver said gently. There's only one of you. Nadia was quiet for a moment. The ventilator hummed from somewhere above them, the monitor cadences, the distant sound of the city outside the glass. When? She said. Monday, Carver said, if you're willing. Nadia looked at Helen. Helen gave her a nod that contained a great deal. 11 months of watching. of understanding more than she said, of holding a space steady for someone who needed it to be held without being asked why. Nadia set down the coffee cup on the charge desk. She unclipped her hospital ID badge, the one that said Language Services, the one Collins had read 100 times without ever reading it, and placed it on the counter beside the cup. She picked up the coffee again. Monday, she said. Outside the windows, the Chicago sky had gone fully dark. The city lights came up fast against it, bright and indifferent and continuous, the ordinary world carrying on in all directions, unaware. The ventilators cycled. Somewhere in the ER, a new patient was coming in, and the intake nurse was paging Language Services, and someone was going to need to be there. But not tonight. Tonight, Nadia Reyes drank her coffee in the corridor, the director's coin warm in her palm, and let herself be exactly as visible as she had always been. End